Thanks everyone for joining us today to learn a little bit more about the little-known best practices of requirements management. My name is Emily Down, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. We have a fantastic crowd of hundreds of participants tuning in from all over the world, from large Fortune 100 companies to smaller, agile startups. So before we jump in, I just wanted to go over a few quick housekeeping items. We've muted all the lines to minimize any background noise during the presentation, but we encourage your participation and feedback. So please use the questions box, which you should see on the GoToWebinar panel, to submit any questions or comments during today's session. We have a lot of content to cover with two presenters today, so I'll be moderating the questions throughout the presentation. We'll answer as many as we can live at the end. This webinar will be recorded and available to watch later on the Jama Software website as well. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with those details and links. At this time, I'd like to introduce our two featured presenters. We're pleased to have Carl Wiegers, the Principal Consultant at Process Impact, joining us today. Prior to starting Process Impact in 1997, Carl spent 18 years at Eastman Kodak. His responsibilities there included experience as a photographic research scientist, software applications developer, software manager, and software process and quality improvement leader. Carl has provided training and consulting services worldwide on many aspects of software development, management, and process improvement. He's the author of several technical books and one self-help book. He's written more than 150 articles on many aspects of software and has spoken at many software conferences and professional society meetings. Derwin Harris is a senior solutions architect and co-founder here at Jama Software. Derwin brings 12 years of software engineering and management experience to Jama, with significant experience delivering on enterprise-scale software applications. He's a frequent speaker on technology topics at conferences such as the Ajax Experience. Derwin blends deep technical knowledge with a strong customer service and support skills to ensure a successful user experience for all of our customers. So I think that covers the introductions. At this time, I'd like to hand the floor over to Carl Wiegers. Carl, please take it away.
Thank you, Emily. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And greetings from Portland, Oregon, where amazingly it's raining. No one should be too surprised at that. I've been interested in improving how software projects develop and manage their requirements for about 25 years. Today I'm going to discuss 3 requirements management practices that project teams often don't handle well. First, I'm going to talk about the importance of defining a baseline for a set of requirements that you intend to implement in a specific increment or release. Then I'll discuss one of my favorite topics, performing peer reviews of requirement specifications. In my view, this is one of the most important things you can do to ensure quality on a project and to improve your team's productivity. Finally, I'll address another great way to improve your productivity by reusing requirements information that already exists within your organization. After my presentation, Derwin Harris from Jama Software will give you some examples of how to apply these best practices in Jama Contour. In software terms, a baseline is any agreed-upon deliverable that serves as the foundation for subsequent work. A requirements baseline is a reviewed, approved, and agreed-upon set of requirements that are committed to a specific product release or to an increment if you're following an agile or incremental development process. Typically, the requirements in a baseline are a subset of all the requirements that have been specified for the project to date. It's the set of requirements that you think are most important to deliver in the next chunk of development work performed. Many organizations follow some kind of a sign-off process to formalize that agreement. More important than the sign-off ritual, though, is the process of negotiating that agreement and clearly communicating the contents of the baseline to all affected stakeholders, and then managing changes to that baseline as you proceed with the next chunk of work on the project. Now, the act of defining a baseline has several implications. First, formal change control should be initiated at that point. Prior to baselining, you know the contents of the release are still evolving. After baselining, though, the implications of making changes for that scope become larger. So you need to make changes in a more thoughtful and controlled way. Also, managers begin making schedule commitments and determining the resources that they will need to achieve those commitments. Those commitments are affected by changes made to the baseline, which is why even a simple change control process is important. I'm not saying that either sign-off is a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a mechanism that many organizations use to denote the creation of a requirements baseline, even if they don't explicitly use that terminology. Sometimes sign-off or requirements approval is an empty ritual, with it being unclear as to exactly what the participants are saying with their signature. Sometimes it really doesn't mean anything at all. You know, you end up signing off on the requirements, and then change starts flying in, even though as though no one had even thought about the fact that we had made an agreement. And then later on, you go back and talk to one of the senior managers who says, well, yeah, I signed off on those requirements, but I didn't have time to read all that. I didn't understand it all, and I trusted you guys, but you let me down. So that doesn't really solve the problem just because you have some kind of a sign-off ritual. Now, if you do have some kind of a sign-off process or any other approval mechanism in your organization, I think it's a very good idea for all of those involved to know exactly what they're agreeing to. So here's a suggestion of maybe what sign-off ought to really mean. First of all, when you sign on the dotted line, it's that you're saying with your signature, I agree this document represents our best understanding of the requirements for this release today, and that the system described will satisfy our needs as we currently understand them. But it doesn't stop there. I further agree that we will make future changes in this baseline through the project's defined change process. And here's the part nobody likes. I realize that approved changes may require us to renegotiate the cost, resource, and schedule commitments of this project. Nobody likes that, but the fact is that change always has a price. Doesn't mean we're trying to stifle change at all. It doesn't mean that we can't make changes, but it always has a price, whether you like that or not. And even the act of discussing a proposed change and then deciding, no, we're not going to do this, that still takes some time. That has a price. Now, I know of some organizations that have taken language like this, and if this isn't just right for you, fine, change it to whatever you think would be meaningful for you, but then put that right on to whatever document page you use to collect signatures if you do have a sign-off process. And that way there should be no ambiguity at all in the minds of those who are participating in this ritual as to exactly what we're saying when we go through this process of sign-off. But even if you don't go through a formal sign-off process, you do still need some clear way to indicate that agreement on a baseline has been achieved and what the implications of that are. So here's a few tips to keep in mind, success tips to help your organization be more effective in the way it baselines its requirements. First, determine all of the stakeholders who need to be involved in agreeing to the contents of a particular baseline. It's frustrating to go through this process of defining a baseline only to have some overlooked stakeholder come back later and then complain about it because they were left out and didn't agree with the decisions that were made. Anytime you have a group of people who need to arrive at decisions, they should first select a decision rule, a process for making those decisions. There are a lot of choices. We could vote in majority rules. Maybe we vote and it has to be unanimous. Or maybe we reach consensus. Those are all different things. Maybe there are decisions a group makes, but then somebody has veto authority over that. Or maybe we delegate decisions to certain individuals. So there are a lot of possible decision rules a group can follow, and I think it's a good idea to choose your decision rule for agreeing on a baseline before you confront your first baselining choice. Now, the key stakeholders probably define the scope for a planned release or increment from a business point of view, so we need to make sure that the detailed requirements that we include in any particular baseline truly do lie within that scope for the body of work that we're intending to complete. If they don't lie in scope, then they really don't belong in that baseline unless you redefine the scope so it accommodates the requirements that you think you want to get in that next chunk of work. You should define a separate baseline for each release or increment, each discrete piece of development work that you intend to do. Now, this doesn't have to be a big, complicated, formal thing. You know, process stuff like this sometimes scares people away. It doesn't scare me because I know it gives me some structure to work within. It gives us a clear, shared understanding of what we're trying to accomplish when we go to work for the next week or two, or 4 weeks if you're doing some cycle time like that, or maybe for the next 2 years if you're building something big and you're baselining all the requirements for it at once. It's important to have no confusion at all in the minds of the project participants whether a certain requirement is included in a particular baseline or not. Now this can get confusing because change does happen, and sometimes you write a specification or collect requirements in some other form like a database or a Excel spreadsheet or something, but you collect a bunch of requirements for your product as a whole, and yet maybe for the next increment you're only going to do some subset of those. So you have to make it really clear as to which requirements belong in a particular baseline so people don't end up overlooking something or working on things that they're not supposed to be working on yet. So we really got to make it easy to do this, and tools can help you manage this. It's very tedious to do this by hand for any sizable project with a lot of increments, but tools can make it easy to move a requirement from one baseline to another as things change during the course of the project. Finally, follow your change control process if you need to alter which requirements are included in the baseline or to modify the details of those requirements. We don't want to restrict change, we want to manage it effectively. A baseline is a structure, not a straitjacket. So just a few thoughts there about how to define this agreed upon set of requirements for a certain body of work and use that to guide the work so everybody's really working from the same page, literally. So let's turn our attention to another topic, software peer review. Project teams perform many types of activities called reviews, and here's a definition of what I mean when I say peer review. It's an examination of a software work product, or any other work product, it doesn't have to be software, by people other than the author of that work product with the goal of defining or of identifying defects. And a defect could be defined as any place where the work product departs from what it's supposed to be. It doesn't follow its specification or it doesn't conform to some relevant standard. But along the way, we also get for free, besides finding defects and improving quality, we get a lot of improvement opportunities. And we can fold those into how we do our subsequent work on the project. I think peer reviews are really important. I started getting serious about this around 1988, and I just cannot imagine now working in an organization where peer review is not a standard part of its culture and practice. We have to do peer reviews simply because people make mistakes. Even smart, talented, experienced people make mistakes. Often we're too close to our own work to spot the mistakes we've made, so we need to get a little help from our friends to find these problems. Now, I'm never happy to learn that I've made a mistake, of course, but I consider it a good catch whenever one of my colleagues points out my error instead of waiting for the customer to call to report a problem. And I believe that the highest leverage quality practice available to the software industry today is formal review of requirement specifications. And this is because it costs so much less to fix a defect shortly after it's created than much later in the project, or worst of all, in operation. So I think this is really important. I think of 4 perspectives that ought to be represented when you're selecting reviewers for requirements. First would be the author of the work product or some peers of the author. So typically when we're talking about requirements, we've got the business analyst involved as the person who most likely organized and documented the requirements and created whatever deliverables that we call requirements we want to look at. But you can't review a work product in a vacuum. Think about code. I could review some code that's just gorgeous. It's a model of how code should be written. It's perfectly consistent. It's beautiful to read and understandable. Can find absolutely no errors in it. But if it does not satisfy its design or its requirements, it's wrong. So we have to review work products in some context that tell us what is it supposed to be, what is it supposed to do. So we really need to think about having people who provided the requirements to the business analyst participate in the review, whoever those might be, whether they're product champions or other user representatives or product owners or subject matter experts or maybe a higher level requirements document. Whoever wrote that should make sure that everything got translated properly by the analyst. A third perspective is any downstream victims of the requirements, anybody who's going to have to do work based on the body of requirements. So that would be people, of course, like designers and programmers who are developing the software, testers who are going to be testing it against the requirements, project managers and other kinds of people, any of your project roles who are going to have to do work based on the requirements. would be good candidates to review them because they're going to find different kinds of problems. For example, I love to have testers review the requirements because they're very good at spotting things like missing exceptions. You know, they'll ask, well, what should happen in this case? And we think, we didn't really specify that. Okay, so you found a missing requirement. So testers are great to do that. And then the fourth perspective we should consider would be representatives of any products or systems to which ours connects in some way. So those might be people who can check the interfaces and make sure that we're going to be talking properly to their system, or that any changes we make are properly mirrored in the system that is on their end. Or if you've got a hardware and software product, people involved with the hardware should certainly be looking at the software and looking at interfaces and partitioning and functionality. So think about these four perspectives when you're choosing representatives for reviewing any set of requirements. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can do peer reviews. The simplest type of peer review simply involves handing the work product to one of your colleagues and asking them to take a look at it. Now, when they hand their comments back to you, you don't normally have any idea about what they actually did to examine the work product. So often those kinds of reviews, and incidentally I call that type of review where you just pass it out to one person, a peer desk check. And if you pass it out to a number of people, I call that a pass around. So often those sorts of reviews can be helpful, but in other cases you want to have a group of people take a more structured approach to reviewing some important deliverable. So here I want to just briefly describe to you an overall view of a team review process, such as the technique called software inspection. Inspection is the most formal, most rigorous form of technical peer review, and the form that's most effective at finding defects. So the way this works basically is we start with some kind of initial work product that we suspect might contain some defects that we would like to ferret out, and we do a little planning to figure out exactly what we need to look at, because maybe you don't need to review the whole work product. Maybe there are certain parts you're more nervous about, and that's where we want to focus our attention. We choose the appropriate reviewers. We think about how much time it's going to take to go through this and so forth. So that all happens in planning. And we get the materials out to the participants. Now, an absolutely critical step for peer review is called individual preparation. And during preparation, each participant goes through the material on their own to look for various types of errors that might be in there and to make sure they understand the product. So we don't want to skip this step. For example, if you're doing a kind of asynchronous review where maybe you are using a tool so that people can look at the work product at their convenience and then they're going to just put in their comments, this is all you're doing really, is the preparation step of people looking through it, making observations and sharing those observations. If you're doing a type of peer review that involves a meeting, then this is an absolutely critical preliminary step. If you go to a review meeting and you have not already looked over the work product, then you should just cancel the meeting because you're wasting your time. It's simply not going to be a good use of time. So in this team review process, we typically do have a meeting, and there are various ways to structure that. In an inspection, you don't just have people saying, okay, anybody got any questions on page 1? You actually have somebody called a reader who goes through and describes their interpretation of each of the requirements one by one so that other people can see whether that compares to their understanding of what the requirement was about and raise any issues they have with that. And we want to record these so we have somebody taking notes, or we have some kind of a tool in which we're capturing the observations and suggestions people raised during the meeting. And you know what almost always happens after any kind of review activity is rework. People often don't plan for that. I've seen many project plans that said, okay, here we're going to do some building of something, and then here we're going to do some reviewing of something, and then we move on. And that's just not been my experience. My experience has been that you build something, you review it or test it, and then you go fix some stuff. And then maybe you review it and test it some more, and eventually you move on. So be sure to build rework planning into your thinking about what you're going to do as part of the review activity. And following review, you may end up having to do following rework, you may end up having to do a subsequent review if there were major changes or problems found. But eventually you're going to get to the point that you think you fixed everything you need to, and now you have a new baseline work product that's the foundation for whatever comes next in your project. So this is the typical way that a team review activity works. Now I'm going to give you a few guiding principles for effective peer reviews. These are things that I've learned over the years, and I consider these pretty much stone tablet kinds of guidance. And these apply to any type of review that you're going to be doing. Perhaps most importantly, we need to check our egos and our weapons at the door. And this is a hard thing to do. Peer reviews are very much a social kind of interaction as well as a technical practice. And you really have to learn how to do this, how to set your ego aside as the author of the work product so that you're receptive to constructive critical input, but also set your ego aside as the reviewer. You're not there to show everybody how smart you are. You're there to help make the work product better. And one way we handle this is to make sure we direct our comments at the work product, not at the author of the work product. This seems like a small thing, but it really makes a difference in how it feels and how you can avoid getting resistance from the people who are submitting their work for review. Keep the team small if you're doing a group review. Now, if you're doing a meetingless review, you can invite as many people as you want to participate. I'm just now starting to write a third edition of my software requirements book, and we're putting together a review team, and we're going to have at least 20 people involved with that. But if you're going to have a review meeting, you really don't want to have more than maybe 7 people involved, because otherwise things go slower, you get a lot of side discussions, and it just really can bog down. It's important to try to find problems during the reviews, but don't take a lot of time to try to solve them then. That's something you can do offline. If you have a review meeting, don't let it go longer than 2 or 2.5 hours, because that's all the longer your attention span is for these kinds of things. As I mentioned, I really strongly encourage you to require the advanced preparation prior to a meeting, or the meetings are really completely ineffective. And let's focus on finding major errors. Let's not worry too much about typos and commas in the wrong place and misspellings. Those are good things to point out, but let's focus the discussion on finding the big errors, like whole sections of functionality that are missing or assumptions that turn out to be wrong. One of the tools I like to use to help me review things effectively is a checklist. And the checklist, you can download some checklists for a very reasonable fee from my website, processimpact.com. This is a goodies page. We have the URL at the end of the talk. And the checklist reminds you of about a lot of the kinds of errors you typically find in work products of various types, including requirements. Here's a review checklist for a software requirements specification, or SRS. If someone just hands you a document to review, your instinct is to begin at line 1 of page 1 and just read through it to see what jumps out at you as possibly being an error. But there's a better way to approach this. And I like this checklist because it reminds me of things to look for. And eventually you're going to internalize this, but if you're new to performing reviews, I suggest you keep the checklist handy and look at it as you're going through the requirements document. So here's a few tips for how to make your requirements reviews more effective. Make sure you include the right reviewers representing these various perspectives I mentioned earlier. It's a good idea to have people get some training in peer reviews so we know how to do this well, and make sure you understand what you expect from them if you're the author. What kind of feedback are you looking for? Don't wait until you think you're done with a work product before you ask people to look at it, for several reasons. For one thing, you have a lot of psychological resistance at that point to even hearing about problems because you think you're done. And so you tend to dismiss all of the input you might get. So you can start doing incremental reviews early, because that gives you some feedback that you can then use to do a better job on everything that you create after that. So I think doing incremental, inexpensive, quick reviews along the way is a really good way to get going. People tend to go way too fast when they're going through requirements documents and other complex deliverables. As a rough guideline, and this is very rough, maybe figure 3 to 5 pages per hour. Depends a lot on complexity, risk associated with the material you're going through, how familiar you are with it, and so forth, how much is on a page. But the best thing to do is collect your own data so that you can compare how effective are your teams at finding the defects that are in there, depending on how fast they go through it. And use data to help you improve how you do reviews. Have people do preparation effectively. You might have people start at different pages or different parts of the specification, so they're not all just starting at page 1 and doing a really good job on the first 1/3 of the document and then fading out as they get tired and busy. Instead, you might have people start at different parts, because that's how people are going to read it anyway. You might have different reviewers use different parts of the checklist or use different analysis techniques. So there's a lot of things that you can do to try to improve the way your peer reviews work. And in my book, More About Software Requirements, I actually have a chapter about reviews and exactly these kinds of issues. So I'd like to talk now about a third way that you can do a better job of managing your requirements by thinking about some of the various types of requirements reuse that are maybe worth considering. You know, the most efficient way to write software is to write something once and then use it many times. Reusing existing requirements information is a lot cheaper than recreating it over and over. So here are some of the kinds of reuse that you might find appropriate in your environment. Related projects often have functionality in common. One example is around security. There's no reason for every project in your domain to reinvent its login procedures, changing passwords, resetting passwords, and all that sort of stuff, project to project. That's eminently reusable information. If you're re-engineering an existing application, you're almost certainly going to reuse some requirements from the original if you can figure out what they are and if they are maybe actually documented someplace, but you're certainly not going to just throw away the whole thing. You want to keep the knowledge from it. As a product evolves through its life, you'll find certain requirements that get reused from one version to another, while others may be modified or extended as the product matures. So you'll see a fair amount of reuse that way. Anytime you're creating a set of products in a family, they'll have a lot of functionality in common. So reusing that functionality so it appears the same way in each product family member is far better than re-implementing it each time, perhaps slightly differently. This situation also arises when you're producing variations of a product for different customers or markets. If you have a trial version with limited functionality, a professional version, and an enterprise version of a product, there will be a lot of requirements in common, as well as some that are different. Sometimes requirements you incorporated into a specific variation for a particular customer might then get folded back into the common specification for the base product. Also, it's not unusual for specific use cases or features within a particular project to reuse certain individual functional requirements, little bits of functionality and tests. So look for ways to reuse those things across in a single project or within a single project across certain use cases or features. And this will help with consistency as well, so you don't end up doing things a little bit different from place to place. From a user's point of view, that's extremely frustrating to see those things that look like they're the same, but they really don't work quite the same because we didn't do it just along the same set of requirements and designs. So here's a list of some of the various types of project requirements information that might be candidates for reuse. I'll just hit through some of these quickly. Certainly aspects of the business process flows and descriptions of your business processes that you're implementing software for, those are probably going to recur and be stable for a while in the business. Stakeholder and user class descriptions or personas, if you create those are very easy to reuse and can save you a lot of reinvention and rediscovery. Business rules are something that you should definitely be reusing. Data definitions as well as glossary terms, particularly within a vertical industry, and you can see the other kinds of things on here as well. So what you want to do is look for sets or patterns of related requirements to reuse, such as individual bits of functionality plus their associated exceptions, or data objects and their associated validations. And keep your eyes open for common symmetrical situations like undo, redo, or log in, log out. Try to spot common system events that could take place and the system responses you expect these events to trigger. So that's a good candidate for reuse. Sometimes you need to move your thinking up to a higher level of abstraction to get away from specific implementation characteristics so you can see if there's some underlying commonality of requirements that can be reused. Even if the requirements need to be implemented in slightly different ways in various products or platforms, like maybe something for web browsers and for mobile devices, you're going to have to implement them a little bit differently because of the physical constraints. The requirements themselves really might well be the same. One way to handle the reuse of non-functional requirements is by defining specific service levels. For example, suppose you have 3 tiers or categories of acceptable response times for various activities in your application. You could just define those performance requirements very carefully and then simply indicate which of the 3 performance tiers applies to each functional requirement. If you want to succeed with requirements reuse, here are several things that you need to have in place. Hopefully these will help give you some better foundation for successful reuse. As is true for all types of project artifacts that are candidates for reuse, they have to be of very high quality. The potential reusers have to trust the quality of the information so they know that there's little risk associated with reusing something that already exists. An organization that's serious about reuse and the efficiencies it can provide will create mechanisms to make it easy to share and leverage existing information. This means pulling information that has the potential for reuse out of a specific project and putting it in some type of repository to make it easy for others to access and incorporate into their own project. For instance, collecting business rules into a shared business rules catalog as an enterprise-level asset instead of a project-level asset will greatly facilitate reuse of those business rules and making sure that you're conforming to the pertinent rules in a consistent way. As you store information in repositories, use version control to make sure that people always reuse the most current or the most appropriate instance. You might have multiple historical versions of a requirement, and sometimes you might want to actually reuse an older version instead of the current version. So good version management mediated by a tool is really the only way to make that effective. You need to establish common terminology and definitions across your projects, especially in a vertical industry. This will be very helpful for reuse. And in fact, glossaries and data dictionaries are good candidates for reusable information. Sometimes you might find opportunities to adjust the user's requirements somewhat to reuse functionality that already exists. So the business analyst can work with customers to try to find this flexibility. You might have to define the requirements at a higher level of abstraction, like a use case level, rather than the detailed functional requirements level, to facilitate reusing those chunks of information. And the idea of reusing knowledge must be valued by the organization and its managers. Management should reward those who practice reuse most effectively. And not by coincidence, those individuals are also likely to be the most productive on the team. So we've had a quick tour here of three of the kinds of practice areas that I think are often neglected by people who are trying to do a good job in requirements. And the reason we need to follow these and other requirements management best practices is to avoid the unpleasant surprise that happens sometimes at the end of a software project. Surprises in software are never good news. I've never had anybody say to me, "Oh, Carl, the system is so much better than I ever imagined. How can I possibly repay you?" But I think that should be our goal. And I think you'll have fewer surprises if you're thoughtful about defining requirements baselines, reviewing requirements, and looking for opportunities to reuse existing requirements on your projects. So now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Derwin Harris of Jama Software.
So you should see the Contour login screen. And so first off, I guess in the time remaining, I just want to walk you through how these best practices can be applied in Contour. But first, let me just briefly describe what Contour is. Contour is a web-based collaborative ALM solution that supports the capturing, sharing, connecting, and reusing of product artifacts, including requirements, use cases, and even test cases. Contour is highly configurable to work with different methodologies, but obviously today's focus is around the three primary topics of reviews, baselines, and reuse. So I won't be getting to a full product demo here, but that being said, we certainly have plenty of videos, free trials available if you're interested. So with that said, let's go ahead and just dive in. So I'm logging in, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the review process. And I've essentially logged in as a business analyst who is in the process of writing a set of business requirements. And these business requirements could be for a release, or it could be for a specific set of functionality. Again, as like Carl mentioned, oftentimes when you're working with requirements, it's nice to focus on a specific area. It just makes it way more capable and doesn't overwhelm folks with too large of information and too much information. So, but let's pause for a moment and just talk about what my goals are as a business analyst in this environment. For me, at this stage, I'm primarily interested in getting sign-off from the different stakeholders, and I may want to include, as Carl mentioned, the victims of these requirements and other information. So it's important for me to want to involve those different individuals or those folks. Secondly, and possibly more importantly, I want to make sure the requirements themselves are accurate and they're well defined, and that's a critical part of this overall process. Now, normally, this process would have been accomplished using one or more Word documents, along with email or maybe even a document repository, but that process is really fundamentally broken. We're passing entire documents around, and that is simply proven to be cumbersome, inefficient, slow, and as we've learned, error-prone. So what we've done here is we've moved the work into a centrally located and collaborative environment. Still, even here, as Carl mentioned, we want to set up some ground rules. For example, this could be the final stage in a sign-off from the stakeholders, or it could even be an early preview in the sort of preparation phase of a scheduled peer review, where we're going to have a meeting and I just want to get feedback from individuals early and give them the information prior to getting into a meeting. And so depending on what your goals are, it's going to change how you initiate this review. So to just kind of show you what I'm looking at here is, again, the environment is a web-based collaborative environment, and it's really designed to look and act and feel a little bit like a Word document because people will be coming from that environment, and we want them to feel familiar with that information. Second is that I, as an individual, have logged in both as a moderator and an approver. Now, the distinction here is that the moderator is really the person responsible for editing and writing these requirements. And in fact, you could have multiple moderators. You can delegate the moderation as well. Same with the approver process. So there's a lot of configurability in this process. But the reason I've set myself up as both is because I want to be able to show you, the audience, the different views and perspectives of these different users. The moderator, primarily, as I've mentioned, is responsible for simply editing this information. I have filters so that I can quickly look at requirements that are more active, that there are comments around. So again, if I'm dealing with a very large document, it becomes very easy for me to navigate to that section of the requirements rather than having to do a lot of search and finding for that information. The approver's view is slightly different, though similar. I have a few more filters available to me to, again, be able to navigate to areas that demand my attention. For example, items that have comments, items that I'm following, or which items I haven't or have approved. And then if I go down this little checklist here, you can see that my responsibility as an approver is to either approve an item and or mark that item as needs more work. If I have a question on it, I can simply highlight an area that I'm interested in. Maybe this word or phrase doesn't quite make sense to me, and I can provide that feedback directly inside of the environment. I can indicate whether or not I'm just simply providing a general comment, whether I have a question, whether this is a proposed change, and these sort of increase in severity, or whether I'm literally flagging this as an issue, that this is a problem, we need to change this immediately. And this just simply helps the moderator manage the information and the content. Because, as Carl mentioned, when you're doing peer reviews and meetings, you really want to limit the amount of folks involved. But if you're doing reviews in this environment, depending on the scenario, you have the opportunity to involve a few more folks. And so this is an example where we're just looking at the stats page, and what this is telling me is it's showing me where each of the approvers are at in their flow or in their process, how long they've spent in the review. I thought it was funny what Carl mentioned about how sometimes people will sign off on documents and then later said, well, I actually didn't read it, or I just scanned it. You kind of get an indicator here to what degree an approver, this person's finished, but they spent 2 seconds. Obviously, this is demo data, so it's maybe not as accurate. But you do definitely get an indicator of how long people are spending in the review, and that's helpful information. But you'll also notice that I've invited these other folks. These are the reviewers, and they're really just invited to participate in the review process. I don't need their signature. And these, again, could be the engineers, the victims of these requirements. I want them to have an opportunity to see and comment on this information, but I don't necessarily need a signature from them. And again, you can decide in your process what makes sense. Do I need everybody to sign off on this? Maybe not. Maybe I need one person, or maybe I need a majority. We even have a voting mechanism within here if we want to do it that way. So you have a lot of configurability in defining those rules and those processes. But I think what's most important is that obviously we're moving along very well. We've got 4 approved, 3 people haven't finished. But I think more importantly is that we're on version 2. And this really ties the baselines together with this review process. We are now looking at a second version of this document, which means that work has been done around the first version to get to this point. And so I'm actually able to drill back into that historical view if I want to see what took place or what the requirements actually look like at that point in time. And so what you're going to see here is you're going to see the work that took place. And if I scroll down, you'll notice that the view is slightly different in that as a moderator, I can see how many folks have marked this as needs more work versus how many items have been approved. And then there's feedback associated with this, and you can see the highlights as well. And if we look at the feedback, I want to sort of pause here for a moment because this is really that critical point where we're building the most efficiency in the process, because ultimately it's all about being more productive and being more efficient. And one of the things that we heard from a lot of customers working with reviews in the document-centric world is that if Christy and Jackson both had the document on their desk and they're in the process of reviewing it, it's very likely that Christy and Jackson would both make a comment or interpret a requirement differently. And that conflict or that difference isn't going to be resolved or found out until those documents are then either merged or sent back to the moderator, and that's not going to happen until maybe they finish the entire doc. So there's these huge gaps in the process as we're passing these documents around, and then the resolution of those problems then is managed outside of the document itself, either via email or phone calls or other such ways and means. But here, because Christy and Jackson are able to collaborate together, her feedback is immediately seen by Jackson. He can respond. Other folks can chime in and simply agree with that. And then you'll notice as well that I've marked this as done, meaning that I, as the moderator, has actually made a change to it, or I've gone ahead and edited that information. And so all of this is happening in parallel, which is really helping drive the efficiency in this process and ultimately drives us back to the version 2, which is where we're at now. And this is essentially where we get to when I publish the new version out with the changes. And I think the last thing I want to show you is this oh so critical filter, which is the 5 items updated since version 1. This is essentially the delta. And so we heard this again, time and time again, that folks were being required to re-review documents over and over again with no real indicator or understanding of exactly what changed. And so what you really suffer from there is that burnout. They start to just scan the document, or maybe they just read the first few pages and then and begin to read faster and faster as they get to the end of it, or pick sections that are relevant to them. But here, Contour knows which items I approved or which items I didn't approve, and it also knows which items have changed. And so I'm only required to sign off on the items that have changed, or the delta. And I can quickly look at and compare the exact changes. I can see the conversation. And so this is really helping me, as an approver, make a conscientious, intelligent decision without the extra work of not knowing exactly what changed. And at this point, I can finish the review. I can enter my signature. Again, if you require electronic signatures, you don't necessarily need to do that. It depends on the type of approval you're doing, and I can sign off on it. And so that is the process that we're sort of promoting to sort of help facilitate and make this process more efficient. And as like Carl said, really you should define your process and the ground rules in accordance with that, but this will make it more efficient. So with that, I'm going to shift gears, and I'm going to shift gears into reuse and sort of close out what I want to demonstrate today. It's a very different topic from reviews, but they're sort of tied together. And in this case, again, reuse is a big topic. It can be used in a lot of different ways. In my example, I'm kind of taking this library scenario. There's different scenarios, as Carl mentioned. But in this example, we have this website library. And again, it's important to note that while this is a software example, we have lots of customers that are hardware. In fact, I would almost say that hardware is used more often with reuse, but obviously it can be effective with software as well. And in this case, I have these different components, a login component. Now, what's important about reuse here is that we're not simply reusing artifacts per se. It's not that this business requirement is being reused across these different other projects. In this case, customer A and customer B. It's that the entire component is being reused. And that's not just the items themselves, but the relationships that these items have to other artifacts. In this case, these business requirements are related to the functional requirements, and those functional requirements are tested by these test cases. And so we've really created an entire package that we're able to reuse in its entirety, and we're able to keep that entirety in sync. And that's sort of the critical aspect of making reuse more enterprise and more useful in your projects. You'll notice as well that when we talk about reuse, we're also talking about this concept of synchronization. And this is critical and quite important because the name and the description in my example, and again, you can define this, is what I want to keep in sync. That is, I know the name and the description of this business requirement must be the same across all these different artifacts. But the priority and the status field, which are custom fields that I've added, are managed by the individual projects. And so I want to allow the customer A and the customer B to apply their own workflow and to manage those requirements through their own life cycle as they go from design to ultimate implementation or deployment of that project or that website. So that's important. And then lastly, obviously there's a lot I could cover here, but really what I want to show is I want to show a view from the perspective of this, what I'm calling a library manager. So I am the manager of this library, and I'm going to go ahead and just make sure that any changes that I make are going to be applied to all of the different downstream projects. And I can easily do this by looking at a specific component or the entire library. And what it's showing me here is it's actually showing me that the website A is currently out of sync. And so that's sort of a red flag for me, and that could be because I've added either a new requirement or I've changed something, and I can quickly come in and do a comparison, which is going to show me everything. I can narrow down to just see what's changed, and lo and behold, what it's telling me is that there are some new requirements that we've added, and I essentially have the opportunity now to make a decision: do I want this information to be pushed into the Customer A website? And so from this perspective, I'm really taking it from the library manager, but it could just as easily be happening from the project managers in Customer A, where they can pull information down. In addition, it's a great way to actually build new projects from scratch. The project managers inside of whatever customer they're building can pull these components in one by one, depending on what the customer needs are, and then they can even modify it. And so that's a very quick pass-through of reuse. There's obviously a lot of functionality in terms of comparing the changes, merging the changes, branching information, but that really is the fundamentals of what we're offering here. And so with that, I'm going to essentially, I'll pull up the slide here as the last slide, and we'll open it up for questions that folks have on the line. And let me just make sure. So first off, I just want to thank Carl and everybody for joining, and we'll open this up for questions.
Hi, Derwin. Thank you. Thanks both of you for a great presentation. We've gotten a lot of really good questions coming through throughout the presentation today, and so I'm going to try to get to as many of them as we can. I'll start with the first one, which is, how do you get people to buy in and participate, to actively collaborate in a new RM environment?
That's a pretty broad question. Well, first of all, I'm not sure what the new RM environment means, but the way you get people to collaborate is, I think in a lot of ways, the way you get people to change anything, any behavior that we think we want to modify in the project. And what I suggest we do is make sure that everybody understands the consequences of the ways we're currently working and the pain that that causes in the organization. So if people are not collaborating in a way that's effective, then we should see some problems. And by making people aware of those problems, the price we pay for experiencing those problems, then sometimes they get a little more motivated to do something different when they see the impact. A lot of times people aren't aware of the pain points that one individual's or team's behavior leads to. So by making sure we understand that and understand why it's not helping us achieve our goals, sometimes that can help drive change.
Yeah, and I agree, and I'll add to that. You know, it's really about everybody being on the same page. I have been on, it doesn't matter what methodology you're using or what process you're using, it's really about everybody just simply agreeing to it. That being said, you can obviously build in efficiencies, and there's ways in which things work better than others, but ultimately, if not everybody's on the same page, you're going to be running into conflicts. And so that is, whatever you choose to do, that is the most critical and probably the hardest thing to do, is to just simply get everybody in alignment working towards the same goal. So that's important.
Thanks, guys. Also, another question we got was that during a requirements review, should the participants go through the definitions of use cases and scenarios to make sure they're all handled by the requirements?
I think that's an extremely important idea. In fact, that gets to the idea of reviewing any work product in a context. So if your deliverable that you're looking at is, say, a detailed requirement specification of whatever form, then one of the things we have to do is make sure that that specification fully and correctly satisfies any higher level requirement spec. So if you derive some functionality from use cases or stories or something, then yeah, we definitely want to start with those higher level of abstraction and earlier predecessor deliverables and say, all right, did we correctly translate everything? Is there anything we missed here? Are there any inconsistencies we've generated between the predecessor and the derivatives from that? So yeah, I think that's a very good idea.
Yeah, and in fact, that's even universal. I know that being a developer, there was oftentimes, I was always handed the use case or the stories, whatever methodology we were using at the time, but I had no context as to where that came from. I didn't have access to the original requirements or the business rules or even the conversations that took place. And so it's definitely critical that as part of the review process, but as part of your general implementation, that you have that connection so that at any point in time in the phase of the process, you have access to that information, that conversation, or even just the requirements of the business rules themselves, because it just provides so much understanding and conception around what we're building, and it just makes everybody more empowered to be on the same track and on the same alignment.
Thanks, you guys. Another question we got, this is about reuse. So when reusing requirements, how do you avoid missing needed changes?
Derwin, you probably have some thoughts on that.
It's a good question. I can answer. I actually have more questions back. But when you're doing reuse, there's different, obviously, structures in which you would implement this. And the synchronization is critical because as changes occur, it's going to be immediately evident that those changes exist. And then you can decide, do you want to enable people to push those changes down, or do you want to enable folks downstream to pull those changes in? But that doesn't change the change control process in general, but it does enable you to have that change control process focus on a specific area. That is, where does the change take place? Does it take place in the library, or are the projects themselves allowed to manage their own change, and then that change can be pulled up into the library for future use? And I think that all goes back to what Carl was saying, and hopefully I've answered the question effectively, but that's my understanding.
I think that is a very good point, Derwin, is to be able to see what's the scope of the reuse. You know, what level of abstraction should that apply to? Is it subsystem level, or project level, or program level, or enterprise level, and be able to move that up to or down to the appropriate scope so that you don't end up affecting something that you didn't really intend to, but then you have the potential, if it's appropriate, to reuse something more in the future instead of just being a little local, quick reuse issue. But really, a lot of this boils down to collaboration again, because you have to have the right people looking at these things who have broad enough perspectives to see the implications. Sometimes if you reuse one requirement, it may be that that drags along several other things with it that are logically connected. So you want to have some awareness, hopefully through a tool that shows you to what other requirements is this one connected, to try to avoid getting something burned. You're getting burned by something that you didn't do as completely as you thought you were. So you really just need people that have a broad enough and deep enough understanding of the issues to try to catch those things instead of just getting blindsided by them.
Agreed.
Thanks, guys. So another question, this one's on sign-off. Should sign-off be obtained on high-level requirements or on detailed requirements, or should it be on both?
Well, I would say it should be on both, because the higher level, for example, the business requirements that you might collect into a vision and scope document or a project charter or something like that, that sets the stage for a whole lot of work that's going to follow, like all of it. The whole rest of the project is going to be based on what guidance is provided and what directions are set by those higher level business objectives. And so it's imperative to have agreement on those. And then that doesn't necessarily kind of get grandfathered into an agreement on the more detailed requirements that are allocated to specific baseline. That's a different issue. So I think you do need to reach agreements at both of those levels. And you know, at the higher level, then it becomes much more expensive to deal with changes. You know, change has much bigger implications if it's at the overall product vision level than if it's at the level of scoping a single iteration. And so we need to more carefully consider the implications of a change than the business impact of that change when you're making it, because it really is a business decision at that point. So yeah, I would advocate for approval at both of those levels.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I totally agree, and I'll add to that they're different, right? That you're definitely approving at those different levels, but they tend to differ slightly in what you're trying to accomplish. I would say at the higher level, you tend to be getting sign-off from customers, maybe marketing, maybe the sales department. You know, they have a vested interest in what we're building, and oftentimes that's defined at that high level. Now, as we get down to the more technical requirements, you're getting buy-in from the engineering team. You know, is this technically feasible? Does this make sense? Is this possible? And there may even be a back and forth that occurs with that, whereas the engineers realize, oh, this is going to be hard to do. We can't meet that requirement, and that's going to go back up to the customers. And so they're not only are they connected, but they do involve different folks. And again, sort of to Carl's point, you want to involve the engineering team early, but it's sometimes not until those technical requirements that you start vetting out the feasibility and the complexity of it.
Yeah, a real important point that information is generally created by different people at different times. You may have different scopes of authority for approval. So, you know, when you're talking about higher level business requirements that are setting the strategic direction of the project, then the person with the checkbook is probably going to be a pretty important approver on that for sign off. But when you're talking about the contents of a specific incremental baseline, then that's probably a much more local decision to be made by different people.
Okay, thanks. So next question is, there definitely seems to be several advantages to using this process. Is it that is the primary business reason for implementing this type of requirements management and collaboration the savings that you'll get in development?
Well, there's lots of benefits. One is certainly the savings you'll get in development, and people don't often see that immediately, because if you ask someone to do something more than they're used to, like saying, okay, we haven't done reviews before, but now we're going to add some time in our requirements process to do reviews, or we're going to take some time to study reuse opportunities or something, then people sort of instinctively feel like, gee, we're just adding work, and that seems stupid. That's just going to slow us down, right? But that assumes that there's a zero return on investment from doing those things. And in fact, I think all of our experience lets us know that there's a very high potential return on investment from finding defects early or reusing something that already exists instead of reinventing it yet again. And so there's a really very high ROI, and that's really the main benefit that you're looking for by doing these kinds of things you know, relatively early. It's kind of the same reason why you want to get good customer input into the project earlier and ongoing rather than just at the end with beta testing or something. You're going to get the customer input eventually anyway. It's just a lot cheaper and a lot less painful to get it earlier rather than later. So you're going to do a much better job of satisfying customer needs, which of course is extremely important, and you're going to be more productive and have less rework, and I think those are all good things.
Yeah, it really is an across-the-board savings. You know, as you're doing these reviews of the requirements, let's say, for example, that you don't do those reviews early on with the customers or the stakeholders, and you move down to development and you find problems with that, and then you go back to it. So you're definitely incurring a cost on the development, and you're ultimately making concessions that you wouldn't have otherwise had to make. But had you done those earlier reviews, you're hopefully eliminating the need to go back to the customer time and time again, because you've defined those requirements in a much more accurate, and really this is about building quality into your process from the get-go rather than waiting until we get into test to make sure that things are built with quality. Quality is something that should be pervasive all the way through, and that includes requirements, use cases, and everything, and not just the code or the technical side of things.
Thanks, you guys. Just a couple of very quick last kind of more tactical questions. Derwin, this one's for you. Somebody asked, is this the Contour 3.6 version?
I am showing the Contour 3.6 version, which is due out on December 12th.
Excellent. Thanks. And then also, Carl, for you, we have another kind of tactical question. When is your new book going to be available?
Well, I think a good starting point for that will be when I actually get a signed contract from the publisher, which we're still working on. We've got a proposal in, and I haven't quite got all that rolling, but we're working on it. And if all goes well, then I would expect it would be out sometime around September of next year. But it's a long time and a lot of pages between now and then.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you both for your presentations today. We did get a lot of really good questions. We tried to answer as many as we could, but we're right up on the hour here now. So any questions that we didn't answer on the line, we'll make sure to follow up with you today. So appreciate everybody tuning in. Have a great day. Thank